Hey there, James here with Penner Trailer Sales. Today we're going to talk about trailer brakes, from small trailer brakes to large trailer brakes, everything you need to know about trailer brakes. First of all, I want to break them down by type. One type being electric drum brakes, and I have that in front of me here. This I have the brake assembly inside of the hub and drum assembly. This is what a electric drum brake assembly looks like. Very basic. This is the electric magnet. The way they function is by this magnet. As you press your brake pedal, it sends current to this magnet, which it varies that current. So a little bit of current will make this magnet a little bit sticky, and a lot of current will make this magnet a lot of sticky. And this magnet then sticks to the inside surface of this drum right here, this smooth surface, and that creates drag. That drag then will cause this arm to slide and function the brakes, which spreads and actually wedges these brake shoes inside of the drum. These are probably the most common type of trailer brakes, and the braking surface then is out on the outside surface of this drum. Some things to consider with electric drum brakes: they will require a brake controller in the vehicle to control them, to be able to send that modulated power back to the brake magnet there to control the braking force. Also, with replacement with these, when you replace these brakes, usually you need to replace this as well as the brake assembly. And the reason for that is by the time this brake assembly wears out, maybe the lining on the shoe is worn down or the magnet is wore out, this drum has been grooved. This surface grooves here, or this surface here will groove. And to put a new assembly in here, that magnet will not be worn to those grooves. So it will only be dragging on the ridges of the grooves, and you need a full surface contact to get the performance from these brakes. So when you replace these, you generally need to replace the hub and drum and the brake assembly together. Also, when replacing these brakes or installing electric drum brakes, they are side specific. So one side, right hand, and a left hand are not interchangeable. They're usually labeled. This one here is labeled as a left hand, so it'll go on the driver's side of the trailer. And the reason for that is that this arm that is here needs to curve so that it will move to the rear. If you put it on the other side, this arm would be facing to the forward. So this arm needs to function in one way for it to get the braking power that it's made to generate. The other main type of brakes are hydraulic brakes. Hydraulic brakes are also used on smaller trailers as well as large trailers. They can either be drum or disc brakes. Drum brakes function look very similar to electric drum brakes, except there's a servo, a hydraulic actuator up here that actuates the brake instead of the electric magnet. Disc brakes are very similar to vehicles in that they use a disc, a brake rotor, as well as a caliper, and the brake shoe in this case is the wear part. On smaller hydraulic brake systems, on smaller trailers, they're generally surge activated. This is an example of a surge actuator. The way they work is when the tow vehicle applies the brakes and applies braking force, the trailer, as it pushes against the tow vehicle, this inner member will slide inside of the outer member, and there's an actuator inside here that creates the pressure needed to function the brakes. One benefit of hydraulic brakes, especially on smaller vehicles, is that the tow vehicle does not need any trailer braking system or trailer brake controller. They're self-contained, they generate the braking force themselves with the surge actuator and so on. One thing that may be needed is a reverse circuit, which is an electrical circuit connected oftentimes to the reverse lights. And when the tow vehicle is put in reverse, it will actuate a solenoid on the brake system, on the brake actuator, that will lock out the trailer brakes, so when the tow vehicle pushes the trailer in reverse, it doesn't function the trailer brakes. One consideration with hydraulic brake systems is that they're often more costly to maintain and replace. The actuator itself, to replace it, can cost anywhere between $300 and $1,000, depending on what components need to be replaced and depending on what model or size that you have. On larger hydraulic brake systems, they will tend to be actuated by an electric brake actuator like I have here. This electric brake actuator receives the same current that the electric drum brakes received from a brake controller, so the tow vehicle will need to have a brake controller to send that signal back. You'll see there's more than one wire here. There's a total of 4. brake actuator will require ground, a constant power to be able to run the pump, but then also the brake circuit, which will receive that modulated braking pressure signal. These units, to replace one of these, will run anywhere, depending on brand, between $900 and $1,100. Now I'd like to move on and look at the cost considerations when repairing and replacing the brakes, starting with the 3,500 pound electric drum brake. This assembly we saw before, I also mentioned, can be self-adjusting or manual adjusting and needs to be replaced generally along with the hub and drum. Cost for a brake assembly like this is going to be $50 to $125. The hub itself is going to be $100 to $130. For hydraulic brake systems on the same size axle, costs are very similar when it comes to the hardware. This hydraulic brake assembly is $70 to $190, but you will find labor costs to be higher because it's a more complex process to replace hydraulic brakes. The lines need to be bled and so on. The most expensive brake system to maintain on a 3,500 pound axle is going to be the hydraulic disc brake. There's more components and they're more susceptible to sitting. So if the trailer's not used regularly, they can bind up and corrode just from not being used. They're more susceptible to that than the other brake types. Expenses for parts here, the rotor itself will be $60 to $150 depending on brand. The caliper will be $110 to $300 depending on brand. And the brake shoes will be $60 to $100 a set. How much of these components need to be replaced at a service will vary, depends on use, depends on disuse, and so on. So a hydraulic disc brake system can get costly to repair and replace. Moving up to the next size, this is a 12x2 electric brake assembly. This is an electric drum brake here. This size of brake will be found on axles rated from 5,200 pounds all the way up to 8,000 pounds actually. Costs on these are $80 to $200 an assembly for the brake assembly and $120 to $300 for the hub and drum. Also, I don't have an example of a hydraulic brake assembly. Costs on those are pretty much the same as the electric brakes. You will also find disc brakes on this same size axle, again from the 5,200 to 8,000. I don't have those costs put here. They're not as common. They're kind of more found on a specialty application, but they are available. I mentioned that this 12x2 brake assembly can be found on axles up to 8,000 pounds. With the 8,000 pound axle, take a minute to talk about those. There's two different versions of the 8,000 pound axle. There's a hybrid axle in which the axle tube and the spindles and the bearings are upgraded to be able to accommodate the 8,000 pounds versus 7,000 pounds, but the brakes are actually the same. They use the same 12x2 brakes on a hybrid 8K axle. The reason they do that is because of the width. On equipment trailers, they'll often try to have a width of 83 inches. It's kind of a standard width. And to be able to maintain that, you can't have a brake drum that's wider than this 12x2. If you have the standard brake for the 8K axle, that I have an example of here, you see that the standard 8,000 brake drum is much wider. When this size brake drum is used, the deck width on an equipment trailer will need to be more 80 or 81 inches at the max, and the same will be on a dump trailer. It can only be 80 to 81 inches wide. So a lot of manufacturers will use the hybrid axle to be able to keep the wider deck width. Some axles will have these. These are more expensive to replace. As you can see, the standard 8K brake assembly is much more substantial. The brake shoes are quite a bit wider. We have more lining on the shoe. And instead of being a stamped backing plate, this is actually a cast backing plate. Naturally, replacement cost on this assembly is going to be more substantial. This unit here will cost you $130 to $375 depending on brand, and the hub to go with it will be $220 to $370. Also on 8K axles, you can find hydraulic drum brakes, which are going to be priced pretty similar to the electric drum brakes. Hydraulic disc brakes are also available for 8K axles. You don't see them as commonly, but they will give you even more braking force than the large drum brakes. Replacement components on those will be $200 for a rotor, up to $400 for the caliper, and $50 to $150 for a set of pads. If you're trying to decide whether or not to order a trailer with disc brakes or drum brakes, disc brakes will add about $2,500 to $3,500 to the cost of the trailer, but you'll make that up in your first maintenance interval. And that's because on the first maintenance interval on disc brakes, generally you only need to replace the pads. So the replacement costs in hardware for disc brakes will be about $200 the first time around, as opposed to replacing the large drum brakes the first time around. Since you'll probably also need to replace the drums, you'll be spending as much as $1,400 per axle to replace those brakes. So that's something to consider over the lifetime of the trailer. Now for the largest class of trailer brakes, the 9,000 to 16,000 pound range, they're all fairly similar in that bracket. The measurements will be 12 to 12.25 inches in diameter, and the width on the shoe will range from 3 to 5 inches, basically depending on size. You'll see this drum is a free drum. This drum unbolts from the hub. Once they get to this size, generally you can replace the replace the drum without needing to replace the hub. Replacement cost will be $400 to $680 for the drum, depending on the configuration, and $150 to $360 for the brake assembly itself. You can see these numbers are starting to get quite a bit more expensive if we go up in size. In this class of axles, the 9,000 pound to the 16,000 pound, hydraulic disc brakes are fairly common. Replacement costs for those are still around $200 for the rotor, generally speaking, $180 to $390 for the caliper, depending on the size, and $125 approximately for brake pads. We mentioned earlier that a hydraulic disc brake system will add about $2,500 to $3,500 on the initial cost of a trailer. That's true for this axle size range from the 9,000 to 16,000 pound range as well. And the replacement cost or the maintenance cost is where you really start to make up the difference. The first initial service on a disc brake system will be around $500 for all four wheels, since you're just most likely needing to do the pads, as opposed to the drum brakes. The first service for those can be up to $2,200 because you'll need to do the drums and the assemblies together, which, as you recall, were quite expensive. So the initial upfront investment that you have with the disc brakes, you'll make up for rapidly in your maintenance cost over the lifetime of the trailer, and you get much superior braking force. Personally, for these larger axles, I would recommend these disc brake systems. Even though it's a little bit more upfront, you'll get that back and you'll just have a safer trailer that can stop itself better. So I hope this has been helpful to give you context and considerations to think of when purchasing a trailer and in your decision-making process of what type of brakes would work best for your application.